Julius Robert Oppenheimer was born on April 22, 1904, in New York City. His parents were Ella Friedman, who worked as a painter, and Julius Seligman Oppenheimer, who was a textile importer. The family was Jewish, but not religiously observant. Oppenheimer had one sibling, a younger brother named Frank, who would also later become a physicist. His father had immigrated to the United States from Hanau, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia, arriving in 1888 as a teenager without formal education or English language skills. Over time, he progressed steadily in the textile business and eventually became financially successful. In 1912, the family moved into an apartment on Riverside Drive, near West 88th Street in New York's Upper West Side. They maintained an extensive art collection that included works by Pablo Picasso, Edouard Vuillard, and Vincent van Gogh. Oppenheimer began his early education at Alcuin Preparatory School and, in 1911, transferred to the Ethical Culture Society School. This school was founded by Felix Adler and followed the principles of the ethical culture movement, which emphasized moral action above religious doctrine. Oppenheimer's father had been involved with the society for many years and served on its board. As a student, Oppenheimer showed interest in subjects such as English, French literature, and mineralogy. He advanced quickly through his studies, completing 2 grades in a single year and skipping part of 8th grade. He also took private flute lessons with Georges Barrère. During his final year, he developed an interest in chemistry. He graduated in 1921, though he postponed further study for a year due to an episode of colitis contracted while the family was vacationing in Czechoslovakia. He spent time recovering in New Mexico, where he became fond of horseback riding and the landscape of the American Southwest. In 1922, at the age of 18, Oppenheimer entered Harvard College. He majored in chemistry, but Harvard's curriculum required courses in a range of other subjects, including history, literature, philosophy, and mathematics. To make up for the year lost to illness, he enrolled in 6 courses per term instead of the usual 4. He was admitted to Phi Beta Kappa and earned graduate standing in physics based on independent work, which allowed him to skip introductory courses. A course on thermodynamics taught by Percy Bridgman drew his interest toward experimental physics. Oppenheimer completed his undergraduate degree in 1925, graduating summa cum laude after 3 years of study. In 1924, after being accepted to Christ's College at Cambridge, Oppenheimer wrote to Ernest Rutherford to request a position at the Cavendish Laboratory. His earlier mentor, Percy Bridgman, had noted in a recommendation that Oppenheimer was not particularly suited to laboratory work and would likely be more successful in theoretical physics. Rutherford was not enthusiastic about the request, but Oppenheimer traveled to Cambridge regardless. J.J. Thomson eventually allowed him to join the laboratory on the condition that he first complete an introductory course in experimental techniques. Oppenheimer did not enjoy his time at Cambridge. In a letter to a friend, he described finding laboratory work dull and felt he was making little progress. He also struggled in his interactions with his tutor, Patrick Blackett, who later became a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. Various accounts from acquaintances describe tensions during this period, though documentation is limited. It is known that Oppenheimer met regularly with a psychiatrist in London, and friends often described him as intensely focused, sometimes to the point of neglecting basic needs such as eating. He smoked frequently and experienced periods of low mood throughout his life. One remark he made to his brother captured his state of mind at the time. He said that he felt he needed physics more than he needed friends. In 1926, Oppenheimer left Cambridge to study under Max Born at the University of Göttingen, which was then one of the major centers for theoretical physics. During his time there, he became part of a circle of young physicists who would later achieve considerable distinction, including Werner Heisenberg, Pascual Jordan, Wolfgang Pauli, Paul Dirac, Enrico Fermi, and Edward Teller. Oppenheimer participated in discussions with great enthusiasm, sometimes more actively than his classmates preferred. On one occasion, a group of students, including Maria Goeppert, signed a petition asking Born to intervene and encourage Oppenheimer to be less disruptive during lectures. Born placed the note where Oppenheimer would see it, and the matter resolved quietly. Oppenheimer completed his Doctor of Philosophy degree in March 1927 at the age of 23, supervised by Born. After the oral examination, one of the examiners, James Frank, reportedly expressed relief that the session had concluded, remarking that Oppenheimer had nearly begun questioning him instead. During his years in Europe, Oppenheimer published more than a dozen papers, many of them significant early contributions to quantum mechanics. Among these was a collaborative paper with Max Born on what became known as the Born-Oppenheimer approximation. This approach separates nuclear motion from electronic motion when analyzing molecules, allowing calculations to be simplified by treating the nuclei as essentially stationary. The paper became one of his most cited works and remained an important contribution to theoretical chemistry and physics. In September 1927, Oppenheimer received a United States National Research Council fellowship to work at the California Institute of Technology. Since Percy Bridgman also hoped to have him at Harvard, the fellowship year was divided between the two institutions. Oppenheimer spent the first part of the 1927-28 academic year at Harvard and the second part at Caltech. While at Caltech, he formed a close working relationship with Linus Pauling. They discussed the possibility of a joint project on the nature of the chemical bond, with Oppenheimer contributing theoretical calculations and Pauling focusing on the chemical interpretation. The collaboration ended before it began, and their personal friendship also came to a close. Years later, Oppenheimer invited Pauling to join the Manhattan Project as head of its chemistry division, but Pauling declined due to his pacifist beliefs. In the autumn of 1928, Oppenheimer traveled to the University of Leiden to visit Paul Ehrenfest's institute. During his stay, he delivered lectures in Dutch, despite having limited experience with the language. It was there that he received the nickname Oppie, later adapted to Oppie by his students. From the Netherlands, he continued on to Zurich to work with Wolfgang Pauli at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Oppenheimer admired Pauli's clarity and critical approach, and it is thought that he adopted aspects of Pauli's intellectual style. When he returned to the United States, Oppenheimer accepted an associate professorship at the University of California, Berkeley. Raymond Thayer Burge, the chair of the physics department, valued Oppenheimer's abilities highly and agreed to share him with Caltech so that he could continue teaching there part-time. Before beginning his position at Berkeley, Oppenheimer was diagnosed with a mild case of tuberculosis. He spent several weeks recovering at a ranch in New Mexico, where his brother Frank was staying. He grew fond of the property, leased it, and eventually purchased it. He called the ranch Perro Caliente, or hot dog, reflecting the phrase he used when he first learned it was available. He often remarked in later years that physics and the desert landscape were his two great interests. Upon recovering, Oppenheimer returned to Berkeley. There, he became known as a highly influential advisor and collaborator to a generation of students. Many found him intellectually compelling and personally captivating in individual conversation, though he could seem distant in larger groups. Some colleagues viewed him as a brilliant and cultured thinker, while others saw him as overly affected or self-conscious. His students, however, generally admired him deeply. often adopting aspects of his speech, posture, and academic habits, including his practice of reading texts in their original languages. Hans Bethe, one of the leading physicists of the century, later described Oppenheimer's teaching as distinguished by his sense of which scientific problems were most important and worth pursuing. Bethe recalled that Oppenheimer met daily with a group of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers to discuss their work across a wide range of subjects, including quantum electrodynamics, cosmic rays, electron pair production, and nuclear physics. During this period, Oppenheimer formed a productive relationship with Ernest Lawrence, whose work with cyclotrons at Berkeley's radiation laboratory was at the forefront of experimental physics. Oppenheimer assisted Lawrence and his team in interpreting their data, contributing theoretical insight to their experimental findings. The radiation laboratory eventually developed into the present-day Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. In 1936, Oppenheimer was promoted to full professor at Berkeley, with an annual salary of $3,300. In exchange, he agreed to reduce his teaching commitments at Caltech. A compromise allowed him to spend 6 weeks each year at Caltech, long enough to teach a single term there annually. During his time at Berkeley, Oppenheimer attempted several times to secure a position for his colleague Robert Serber. These efforts were unsuccessful, in part due to resistance from Raymond Burge, who reportedly felt that one Jewish faculty member in the department was sufficient. Oppenheimer conducted important work across a wide range of theoretical physics, including astronomy connected to general relativity, nuclear theory, spectroscopy, and quantum field theory. He also took an interest in the mathematical foundations of relativistic quantum mechanics, although he was uncertain about its long-term validity. Much of his early work anticipated later discoveries such as the neutron, the meson, and the neutron star. One of Oppenheimer's first major areas of study was the theory of the continuous spectrum. His earliest published paper, written in 1926, dealt with the quantum theory of molecular band spectra. In it, he developed a method for calculating transition probabilities in molecular processes. He also carried out calculations related to the photoelectric effect in hydrogen and X-ray absorption, particularly around the K-edge. His results aligned well with observations of the sun's X-ray absorption, though they appeared inconsistent with helium. Years later, once it was understood that the sun was composed mostly of hydrogen, it became clear that Oppenheimer's calculations had been accurate. He contributed to the understanding of cosmic ray showers and studied field electron emission, work that helped lay the foundation for what is now known as quantum tunneling. In 1931, he co-authored a paper titled Relativistic Theory of the Photoelectric Effect with his student Harvey Hall. Drawing on experimental evidence, they challenged Paul Dirac's assertion that two hydrogen energy levels were identical. One of Oppenheimer's later doctoral students, Willis Lamb, identified the cause of this discrepancy, which became known as the Lamb shift. Lamb received the Nobel Prize in Physics for this work in 1955. Oppenheimer also worked with Melba Phillips, his first doctoral student, on problems involving artificial radioactivity produced by deuteron bombardment. Experiments by Ernest Lawrence and Edwin McMillan with deuterons matched predictions by George Gamow for lighter nuclei but diverged at higher energies and for heavier elements. In 1935, Oppenheimer and Phillips developed a theory, now known as the Oppenheimer-Phillips process, to explain these results. The theory remains a standard part of nuclear physics. In 1930, Oppenheimer published work that effectively predicted the existence of the positron. Dirac had introduced a theoretical framework suggesting the possibility of positively charged electrons with negative energy. Based on available data, Oppenheimer argued that these particles could not be protons and must have a mass equal to that of an electron. In 1932, the positron was experimentally discovered by Carl David Anderson, who later received the 1936 Nobel Prize in Physics. By the late 1930s, Oppenheimer's attention had turned to astrophysics, likely influenced by his colleague Richard Tolman. This period produced several notable papers. In one written with Robert Serber in 1938, he examined the properties of white dwarfs. Another paper, written with George Volkoff, established the maximum mass at which neutron stars remain stable, a limit now known as the Tolman-Oppenheimer-Volkoff limit. In 1939, he and Hartland Snyder published On Continued Gravitational Contraction, which described the process by which massive stars could collapse into regions that would later be called black holes. Along with the Born-Oppenheimer approximation, these papers are among his most frequently cited works. Oppenheimer's papers were often regarded as difficult to interpret due to his preference for compact and mathematically elegant arguments. While his approach was respected, he was sometimes noted for making small mathematical errors, likely due to working quickly. One of his students, Hartland Snyder, summarized the situation by saying that Oppenheimer's physics was strong, but his arithmetic was not. After World War II, Oppenheimer published only a handful of scientific papers, including one in biophysics, and he produced no formal scientific publications after 1950. Murray Gell-Mann, who worked with him at the Institute for Advanced Study in 1951, later observed that Oppenheimer rarely undertook long or detailed calculations. Instead, he contributed short and insightful ideas that influenced others. Gell-Mann noted that Oppenheimer's patience for extended technical work was limited, but his ability to inspire productive research in others was considerable. In 1931, Oppenheimer's mother passed away. Following her death, he drew closer to his father, who still lived in New York, but began visiting California more often. Their relationship became more regular during these years, despite the geographic distance. In 1937, Oppenheimer's father died, leaving an estate valued at $392,600, an amount equivalent to roughly $8.6 million in 2024. The inheritance was divided between Oppenheimer and his brother Frank. Shortly afterward, Oppenheimer prepared his own will, in which he arranged for his estate to be given to the University of California. His intention was that the funds be used to support graduate scholarships. During the 1920s, Oppenheimer paid little attention to political or global events. He later remarked that he did not read newspapers or general interest magazines, and he first learned of the 1929 stock market crash several months after it happened, while taking a walk with Ernest Lawrence. He also said that he did not vote in a presidential election until 1936. Beginning around 1934, his interest in public affairs grew. That year, he allocated about 3% of his annual income, approximately $100 at the time, to support German physicists fleeing the rise of Nazism. During the 1934 West Coast waterfront strike, he and several of his students, including Melba Phillips and Robert Serber, attended a rally organized by longshoremen. After the Spanish Civil War began in 1936, Oppenheimer hosted fundraising events in support of the Spanish Republic. In 1939, he joined the American Committee for Democracy and Intellectual Freedom, which focused on resisting the persecution of Jewish scientists in Nazi Germany. Like many liberal organizations of that era, the committee was later labeled a communist front. A number of Oppenheimer's close friends and family members were active in the Communist Party during the 1930s or 1940s. These included his brother Frank, Frank's wife Jackie, his future wife Kitty, Jean Tatlock, his landlord Mary Ellen Washburn, and some of his Berkeley graduate students. Whether Oppenheimer himself ever joined the Communist Party has been the subject of debate. Some historians argue that he remained outside the party, while others claim he was a covert member during the late 1930s. From 1937 to 1942, he participated in a group at Berkeley that he described as a discussion group. Some members later stated that this was, in fact, a confidential unit of the Communist Party for university faculty. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a file on Oppenheimer in March 1941. The file noted his presence at a 1940 gathering at the home of Haakon Chevalier, where senior officials from the California branch of the Communist Party were also present. The FBI also documented that Oppenheimer served on the executive committee of the American Civil Liberties Union, which the Bureau regarded as a communist front organization. Soon afterward, Oppenheimer's name was placed on the Custodial Detention Index, a list used to identify individuals considered eligible for detention in a national emergency. In 1942, when Oppenheimer began working on the Manhattan Project, he stated on a security questionnaire that he had been a member of just about every Communist Front organization on the West Coast. He later explained that he did not recall writing this statement, that it was inaccurate, and that it may have been an exaggerated remark. He subscribed to People's World, a publication associated with the Communist Party, and acknowledged in 1954 that he had been associated with the broader communist movement. In 1953, Oppenheimer served on the sponsoring committee for a Science and Freedom conference organized by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an anti-communist group. During his 1954 security clearance hearings, Oppenheimer denied being a formal member of the Communist Party. He described himself instead as a fellow traveler, meaning someone who shared certain political concerns with the party but did not accept direction from it. Biographer Ray Monk later wrote that Oppenheimer supported the Communist Party in many practical ways through time, attention, and financial contributions, and that he was highly engaged in its activities during that period. In 1936, Oppenheimer began a relationship with Jean Tatlock, the daughter of a Berkeley literature professor and a medical student at Stanford. They shared similar political interests, and Tatlock contributed articles to The Western Worker, a newspaper associated with the Communist Party. Their relationship continued for several years, but was marked by difficulties, and in 1939, Tatlock ended it. Later in 1939, Oppenheimer met Catherine Kitty Puning. Kitty had previously been a member of the Communist Party and had experienced several changes in her personal life. Her first marriage had been brief, and from 1934 to 1937 she lived with Joe Dallatt, a Communist Party activist who was killed in the Spanish Civil War. After returning to the United States, she earned a degree in botany from the University of Pennsylvania. In 1938, she married Richard Harrison, a physician, and in 1939, they moved to Pasadena, where Harrison became chief of radiology at a local hospital, and Kitty enrolled in graduate studies at UCLA. Kitty and Oppenheimer became involved socially and later personally. After attending a party hosted by Richard Tolman, they spent the night together, an event that attracted some attention among colleagues. In the summer of 1940, Kitty stayed with Oppenheimer at his ranch in New Mexico. When she became pregnant, she asked her husband for a divorce. He agreed, and she obtained a quick divorce in Reno, Nevada. She and Oppenheimer were married on November 1st, 1940. Their first child, Peter, was born in May 1941. Their second child, Catherine, Tony, was born in Los Alamos on December 7th, 1944. During his marriage, Oppenheimer renewed contact with John Tatlock for a period. This ongoing connection later became a point of examination during his security clearance hearings because of Tatlock's political affiliations. During development of the atomic bomb, Oppenheimer was monitored by the FBI and by the security personnel of the Manhattan Project due to his earlier political associations. In June 1943, Army security officers followed him during a visit to California, where he spent time with Tatlock, who was experiencing depression. He stayed overnight at her apartment. Tatlock died by suicide in January 1944, an event that affected him deeply. While living at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer also developed an emotional relationship with Ruth Tolman, a psychologist and the wife of his colleague Richard Tolman. Their connection continued until Oppenheimer moved east to take up his position at the Institute for Advanced Study. After Richard Tolman's death in 1948, they reconnected and remained in occasional contact until Ruth's death in 1957. Only a small number of their letters have been preserved, but those that remain show a close and affectionate bond, including Oppenheimer's use of the phrase "my love" in addressing her. Oppenheimer's wide-ranging interests sometimes drew his attention away from physics. He enjoyed subjects that were difficult or obscure, and because scientific work often came easily to him, he developed an interest in ideas that were more philosophical or symbolic. After entering Harvard, he began reading classical Hindu texts in English translation. His interest grew steadily, and in 1933 he studied Sanskrit at Berkeley under Arthur W. Ryder. In time, he was able to read works such as the Bhagavad Gita and Meghaduta in their original language, and he reflected on them often. The Bhagavad Gita became one of the texts that influenced him most. He described it in letters as both simple and remarkable. He kept a well-worn personal copy on a shelf near his desk, gave copies as gifts to friends, and referred to it throughout his life. While overseeing the laboratory at Los Alamos, he occasionally quoted from it, including at a memorial gathering for President Franklin Roosevelt. He even gave his car a Sanskrit name, Garuda, after the bird associated with the god Vishnu. Although he was interested in Hindu thought, Oppenheimer did not adopt Hindu religious practices. He did not join temples or participate in formal worship. His brother later said that he was drawn mainly to the wisdom and philosophical tone of the Gita. Some colleagues believed Oppenheimer's interest may have begun during conversations with Niels Bohr, as both physicists often discussed ancient mythology and philosophical ideas. In one conversation before the war, Oppenheimer mentioned that he found Hindu writings deeper than those of ancient Greece. Oppenheimer also participated in various intellectual groups. He served on the board of editors for the book series World Perspectives, which published works on philosophy. At Berkeley in the 1930s, he joined a small discussion circle organized by psychologist Siegfried Bernfeld on topics related to psychoanalysis. His colleague Isidore Isaac Rabi, who knew him well through the Berkeley, Los Alamos, and Princeton years, observed that Oppenheimer's broad interests created a certain distance from the everyday approaches of physics. Rabi felt that Oppenheimer sometimes saw more mystery in scientific problems than was actually present, and that his interests outside physics gave him a contemplative quality. Rabi noted that Oppenheimer expressed himself carefully but incompletely, giving the impression of hidden depth. He believed these traits contributed to Oppenheimer's charisma. Despite these reflections on Oppenheimer's philosophical leanings, several physicists, including Luis Alvarez and Jeremy Bernstein, suggested that if he had lived to see later experimental confirmation of his early theoretical work on gravitational collapse, he might have been awarded a Nobel Prize. Some historians and scientists consider his work on neutron stars and black holes among his most significant contributions, though it did not attract much attention during his lifetime. When asked by Abraham Pace to name the scientific work he considered most important, Oppenheimer mentioned his research on electrons and positrons rather than his studies of gravitational collapse. Over the years, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physics 4 times, in 1946, 1951, 1955, and 1967. but he never received the award. In September 1941, during a visit to the University of California, Berkeley, Oppenheimer was informed by the Australian physicist Mark Oliphant about the British atomic bomb program and its MAYAD report. On October 9th of that year, 2 months before the United States entered World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorized an accelerated program to develop an atomic bomb. Shortly afterward, on October 21st, Ernest Lawrence brought Oppenheimer into the early stages of what would become the Manhattan Project. Arthur Compton at the Metallurgical Laboratory assigned Oppenheimer to oversee work related to bomb design. On May 18, 1942, Gregory Bright resigned from his position due to concerns about security and doubts about the project's direction. Compton asked Oppenheimer to assume Bright's responsibilities, particularly the work on fast neutron calculations. Oppenheimer approached the task with considerable dedication. His role was formally titled Coordinator of Rapid Rupture, referring to the behavior of a fast neutron chain reaction. One of his first actions was to organize a summer program at Berkeley on the theoretical aspects of atomic bomb design. A group of physicists, including Robert Serber, Emil Konopinski, Felix Bloch, Hans Bethe, and Edward Teller, worked together to determine the sequence of calculations required for bomb development. In June 1942, the U.S. Army formed the Manhattan Engineer District to oversee the military side of the atomic bomb program. In September, Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves, Jr. became director of the project. By October, Groves and Oppenheimer agreed that work should be consolidated in a single, secure laboratory located in an isolated area. Groves selected Oppenheimer to lead the new weapons laboratory. The decision was unexpected for some observers, given Oppenheimer's earlier political associations and his limited administrative experience. Groves, however, was persuaded by Oppenheimer's broad scientific knowledge and his ability to understand the practical requirements of the project. He believed these qualities were essential for coordinating an effort involving physics, chemistry, engineering, and metallurgy. Groves also sensed a strong ambition in Oppenheimer, which he thought would help drive the project forward. Despite Oppenheimer's background, Groves ordered that he receive security clearance without delay, noting that he was essential to the program. Oppenheimer recommended establishing the laboratory in New Mexico, near the region where he spent time at his ranch. On November 16, 1942, he, Groves, and others inspected a possible site. Oppenheimer was concerned that the surrounding cliffs might feel confining, and the group noted potential problems with flooding. He then proposed another location, a mesa near Santa Fe that housed the Los Alamos Ranch School. Engineers raised concerns about the access road and water supply, but overall the site was considered satisfactory. Construction of the Los Alamos laboratory began soon after, using some of the existing school buildings and adding new structures. Oppenheimer assembled a group of prominent physicists, whom he referred to as luminaries. The laboratory was initially intended to operate under military command, and Oppenheimer and other scientists were considered for Army commissions. Oppenheimer had a uniform prepared and took the physical exam, but he did not pass due to being underweight, having a persistent cough, and experiencing chronic back pain. Ultimately, several scientists opposed formal military commissions, and the University of California agreed to operate the laboratory under contract with the War Department. The scale of the project expanded rapidly. Oppenheimer initially underestimated its size, but Los Alamos grew from a few hundred people in 1943 to more than 6,000 by 1945. Oppenheimer faced challenges in managing such a large and varied group, but he adapted quickly to the administrative and organizational demands. He became known for his command of the scientific aspects of the work and for helping to bridge the differing cultures of scientists and military personnel. Viktor Weisskopf later wrote that Oppenheimer's leadership was distinguished not by the number of ideas he contributed, but by his ability to be consistently present and engaged in the work being done. Weisskopf described how Oppenheimer followed developments closely, appearing in laboratories and discussions whenever new measurements were made or new concepts emerged. His presence created a shared sense of purpose among those working at Los Alamos and contributed to an atmosphere of focus and enthusiasm. During this stage of the war, many of the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project were concerned that the German nuclear program might be further advanced than their own. In a letter dated May 25, 1943, Oppenheimer responded to a suggestion from Enrico Fermi regarding the possibility of using radioactive materials to contaminate German food supplies. Oppenheimer asked Fermi whether a sufficient quantity of strontium could be produced without involving too many people in the process, and remarked that such an effort would only be practical if enough material could be produced to have large-scale effects. In 1943, research at Los Alamos focused on designing a plutonium gun-type weapon known as Thin Man. Early studies were conducted using small amounts of plutonium-239 produced in a cyclotron. This material was highly pure but available only in very limited quantities. When the first sample of plutonium from the X-10 graphite reactor arrived in April 1944, scientists found that reactor-produced plutonium contained a significantly higher proportion of plutonium-240. This made it unsuitable for the gun-type design because the spontaneous fission rate was too high. By July 1944, Oppenheimer decided to discontinue work on the Thin Man design and shifted research toward an implosion-type weapon. This method used carefully arranged chemical explosives to compress a subcritical mass of fissile material into a smaller, denser configuration. Because the material traveled only a short distance during compression, the critical mass could be achieved much more quickly. A reduced version of the original gun-type design, using only highly enriched uranium, was retained and eventually became known as Little Boy. In August 1944, Oppenheimer reorganized the structure of the Los Alamos laboratory to support the implosion effort. Work on the simplified gun-type device continued within a single group. This weapon was completed in February 1945. The more complex implosion device, often referred to as the Christie gadget after Robert Christie, one of Oppenheimer's former students, reached its final design stage in a meeting held in Oppenheimer's office on February 28, 1945. This design became known as Fat Man. In May 1945, the interim committee was established to guide both wartime and post-war policy concerning nuclear energy. A scientific panel was formed to advise the committee, consisting of Oppenheimer, Arthur Compton, Enrico Fermi, and Ernest Lawrence. In their recommendations, the panel considered not only the physical characteristics of an atomic weapon, but also its potential military and political implications. Their work included discussions on whether the Soviet Union should be informed about the weapon before it was used against Japan. In the early morning of July 16, 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the work conducted at Los Alamos reached its conclusion with the first test of a nuclear device. Oppenheimer had chosen the code name Trinity for the test site the previous year. He later explained that the name was inspired by the poetry of John Donne, whose work he had first encountered in the 1930s through Jean Tatlock. Brigadier General Thomas Farrell, who stood with Oppenheimer in the control bunker during the test, later described Oppenheimer as visibly tense in the final moments before detonation. When the explosion occurred, Oppenheimer's expression changed to one of relief. His brother Frank recalled Oppenheimer's immediate reaction as the simple remark, "I guess it worked." A 1949 profile recounted that Oppenheimer associated the event with lines from the Bhagavad Gita, comparing the brightness of the explosion to the radiance of many suns. In a 1965 interview, he reflected that the test prompted a variety of reactions among those present. Some laughed, some cried, and many were silent. He recalled thinking of a passage in which Vishnu, in a moment of persuasion, reveals a powerful form and speaks of becoming a force of destruction. Colleagues later described Oppenheimer appearing noticeably different after the test. Isidore Rabi recalled seeing him walk with a confident posture, suggesting that he felt the project had reached its intended goal. Although many scientists opposed using the bomb against Japan, Oppenheimer, along with Arthur Compton and Enrico Fermi, believed that a demonstration of the device would not lead to Japanese surrender. On August 6th, the evening of the bombing of Hiroshima, Oppenheimer addressed a gathering at Los Alamos. According to accounts, he clasped his hands together while the crowd applauded and expressed regret that the weapon had not been ready earlier in the war. On August 17th, Oppenheimer traveled to Washington to deliver a letter to Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, expressing his deep unease about nuclear weapons and his hope that they would eventually be restricted or banned. In October, he met with President Harry S. Truman. Their conversation was strained. When Oppenheimer said that he felt he had blood on his hands, Truman responded that responsibility for the decision rested with the president alone. Truman later remarked that he did not wish to meet with Oppenheimer again. In 1946, Oppenheimer received the Medal for Merit from President Truman in recognition of his leadership at Los Alamos. After the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the existence of the Manhattan Project became public knowledge. As a result, Oppenheimer quickly became widely known and was frequently referred to as the father of the atomic bomb. He became a public figure and was often asked to comment on scientific matters. Magazines such as Life and Time placed him on their covers, reflecting the growing role of scientists in national and international affairs. During this period, nuclear physics gained prominence as governments recognized the strategic and political significance of atomic weapons. Like many scientists of his time, Oppenheimer believed that lasting security in a world with nuclear weapons would require international cooperation. He felt that organizations such as the newly created United Nations might provide a framework for limiting nuclear competition and reducing the possibility of an arms race. In November 1945, after the end of the war, Oppenheimer left Los Alamos and returned to teaching at Caltech. He soon found, however, that his interest in academic life had diminished. In 1947, he accepted an invitation from Lewis Strauss to become director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. This required him to move back to the East Coast and leave behind Ruth Tolman, with whom he had developed a relationship after departing Los Alamos. The directorship offered a salary of $20,000 per year and included the use of a rent-free, historic 17th-century house situated on 265 acres of wooded land. The property came with a cook and a groundskeeper. Oppenheimer furnished the home with European furniture and built an art collection that included works by Cézanne, Derain, Despiau, de Vlaminck, Picasso, Rembrandt, Renoir, Van Gogh, and Vuillard. At the Institute, Oppenheimer gathered scholars from a wide range of fields. He supported the work of leading scientists such as Freeman Dyson, as well as Chen-Ning Yang and Tsung-Dao Lee, who later won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating parity non-conservation. He also opened temporary positions to scholars in the humanities, including T.S. Eliot and George F. Kennan. Some members of the mathematics faculty preferred the institute to focus solely on scientific research. and viewed these broader initiatives with some hesitation. According to Abraham Pius, Oppenheimer later regarded his inability to bridge the gap between the sciences and the humanities as one of his shortcomings as director. During the late 1940s, a series of conferences, Shelter Island in 1947, Pocono in 1948, and Oldstone in 1949, helped physicists transition from wartime research back to theoretical issues. Under Oppenheimer's guidance, they returned to long-standing problems in quantum electrodynamics, particularly the divergent expressions that had puzzled physicists before the war. Julian Schwinger, Richard Feynman, and Shinichiro Tominaga developed new techniques, later called renormalization, to address these difficulties. Freeman Dyson showed that their approaches were consistent with each other. Discussions led by Oppenheimer also encouraged Robert Marshak to propose the two-meson hypothesis, distinguishing between pions and muons, which eventually contributed to Cecil Powell's discovery of the pion and subsequent Nobel Prize. Oppenheimer remained director of the Institute for Advanced Study until 1966, giving up the position when his health began to decline. As of 2023, he remains the longest-serving director in the Institute's history. As a member of the Board of Consultants to a committee appointed by President Truman, Oppenheimer had a significant influence on the 1946 Acheson-Lilienthal Report. The report recommended establishing an international atomic development authority that would own all fissionable materials and the facilities needed to produce them, including mines, laboratories, and power plants. Bernard Baruch was then asked to present these ideas to the United Nations, resulting in the Baruch Plan. This plan added several enforcement measures, including the inspection of Soviet uranium resources. The Soviet Union viewed these terms as favoring the United States, and the proposal was rejected. The failure of the plan made it increasingly clear to Oppenheimer that an arms race was likely due to deepening distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1947, the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, was established as a civilian agency overseeing nuclear research and weapons development. Oppenheimer became chairman of the AEC's General Advisory Committee, GAC. From this position, he advised on a wide range of issues, including budgets, laboratory development, and international policy, though his advice was not always followed. As chairman, he continued to advocate for international arms control and support for basic scientific research, hoping to reduce the likelihood of escalating competition between nations. In August 1949, the Soviet Union conducted its first atomic bomb test earlier than expected. This led to an intense debate within government and scientific circles about whether the United States should pursue a hydrogen bomb, then referred to as the super, which relied on nuclear fusion rather than fission. Oppenheimer had been aware of the theoretical possibility of such a weapon since the Manhattan Project and had allowed limited theoretical study of it. After the war, however, he argued that work on the super was unnecessary and would result in extremely high civilian casualties. In October 1949, Oppenheimer and the GAC recommended against developing the hydrogen bomb. Their concerns were partly ethical, as they believed the weapon's use would cause destruction far beyond that of existing atomic bombs. They also doubted its feasibility at that time, since no workable design existed. The committee felt that the United States' existing or potential stockpile of atomic weapons would be sufficient to deter a thermonuclear attack. They also worried about the diversion of resources, such as nuclear reactors, from atomic weapons production to materials required for a hydrogen bomb. The AEC initially supported the GAC recommendation, and Oppenheimer believed the effort to prevent the development of the hydrogen bomb would succeed. However, supporters of the weapon lobbied strongly. On January 31, 1950, President Truman announced the decision to proceed with developing the hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer and others who opposed the decision, such as James B. Conant, felt discouraged and considered resigning, but ultimately remained on the GAC. In 1951, Edward Teller and Stanislaw Ulam introduced the Teller-Ulam design, which presented a technically feasible approach to a hydrogen bomb. Oppenheimer accepted that development of the weapon would continue, but remained interested in raising broader questions about its testing and deployment. He later remarked that while the early program had been technically uncertain, the new design was clear and workable, shifting the debate from scientific concerns to political and ethical ones. When Oppenheimer, Conant, and Ledoux Bridge reached the end of their terms in August 1952, they were not reappointed. President Truman preferred new committee members who supported hydrogen bomb development, and several critics of Oppenheimer encouraged the administration to remove him. With this, Oppenheimer's formal role in shaping U.S. nuclear policy through the GAC came to an end. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, Oppenheimer served on several government panels and study groups. These positions placed him at the center of discussions about national security, scientific policy, and nuclear strategy, sometimes drawing him into disagreements within government circles. In 1948, he chaired the Department of Defense's Long-Range Objectives Panel, created by AEC liaison Donald F. Carpenter. The panel examined the potential military uses of nuclear weapons and the ways in which they might be delivered. In 1952, after a year of study, Oppenheimer prepared the draft report for Project Gabriel, which considered the effects of nuclear fallout. He also served on the Science Advisory Committee of the Office of Defense Mobilization. In 1951, Oppenheimer took part in Project Charles, which assessed whether the United States could develop an effective air defense against an atomic attack. A related follow-up, Project East River in 1952, recommended creating a system that could give roughly 1 hour of warning before such an attack. These studies led to Project Lincoln at MIT's newly established Lincoln Laboratory, where Oppenheimer became one of the key scientific figures. During the Lincoln Summer Study Group, he and other scientists recommended allocating more resources to air defense rather than focusing primarily on long-range strategic bombing. The U.S. Air Force objected to these conclusions, concerned that they reflected an overly rigid defensive strategy. Over time, however, the work helped lead to the establishment of the Distant Early Warning Line, a radar network in the Arctic. Edward Teller, who had shown limited interest in the wartime atomic bomb work at Los Alamos, left in 1951 and helped establish a second laboratory in 1952, later known as Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Oppenheimer opposed the creation of this second laboratory and defended the history and work of Los Alamos. Oppenheimer also contributed to Project Vista, a study of U.S. tactical warfare capabilities. Although he joined the project late, he wrote a significant section recommending the development of smaller tactical nuclear weapons, which he believed would have more practical use in limited conflicts. These ideas challenged the Air Force's emphasis on large thermonuclear weapons delivered by long-range bombers. The Air Force responded critically, and the report was ultimately suppressed. In 1952, Oppenheimer chaired the State Department panel of consultants on disarmament, which urged postponement of the first planned hydrogen bomb test in the hope of negotiating a thermonuclear test ban with the Soviet Union. The recommendation was not adopted, and the Ivy Mike test proceeded. The panel's final report, released in January 1953, reflected Oppenheimer's view that neither the United States nor the Soviet Union could maintain a decisive nuclear advantage, though both possessed the ability to cause severe damage. One recommendation that Oppenheimer considered especially important was for the government to increase transparency with the public regarding nuclear realities. The suggestion was well received by the incoming Eisenhower administration and contributed to Operation Candor, an effort to educate the public about nuclear issues. Oppenheimer later wrote about the limited usefulness of expanding nuclear arsenals in a 1953 Foreign Affairs article, which drew considerable attention. By 1953, Oppenheimer held numerous advisory roles and had access to important strategic information, giving him significant influence. At the same time, his positions on nuclear matters created opposition from advocates of strategic bombardment and hydrogen bomb expansion. His prominence and ability to shape opinion led some within the military and government to view him with suspicion. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had monitored Oppenheimer since before the war because of his earlier ties to Communist Party members at Berkeley, including his wife and brother. Wiretaps and informants led the FBI to believe he might have been a member himself. By the early 1940s, his home, office, mail, and phone were under surveillance. In August 1943, Oppenheimer told Manhattan Project security officers that a man named George Eltonton had attempted to obtain nuclear information for the Soviet Union. He later acknowledged that the approach had actually been made to him by his friend Håkon Chevalier, who had mentioned the possibility in a private conversation. When questioned again years later, Oppenheimer's earlier statements and later corrections were presented together, causing confusion and contributing to concerns about his reliability. The FBI provided material to Oppenheimer's critics, including Lewis Strauss, an AEC commissioner who disagreed sharply with Oppenheimer on several issues and had felt personally slighted by him in the past. Tensions increased in 1949 when Oppenheimer testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee about past associations with communists among his students and acquaintances. His brother Frank and Frank's wife Jackie testified that they had been Communist Party members, leading to Frank's dismissal from his university position. On November 7, 1953, William Borden, formerly of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, sent Hoover a letter asserting that Oppenheimer was, more probably than not, a Soviet agent. President Eisenhower did not fully accept this claim, but felt obligated to investigate. On December 3, 1953, he ordered that Oppenheimer be denied access to classified information pending review. On December 21st, Strauss informed Oppenheimer that his security clearance had been suspended and invited him to resign. Oppenheimer chose instead to request a hearing. The charges were outlined by AEC General Manager Kenneth D. Nichols, who personally believed Oppenheimer was loyal, but still drafted the letter as required. The hearing, conducted in April and May 1954, focused first on Oppenheimer's past political associations and then on his opposition to the hydrogen bomb. The interrogations included references to the Eltonton Chevalier episode, and Oppenheimer was confronted with transcripts he had not seen in advance. Edward Teller testified that although he believed Oppenheimer loyal, he preferred that nuclear decisions rest with others whose views he understood better. His testimony caused significant backlash in the scientific community. Ernest Lawrence did not testify in person due to illness, though a prior interview expressing criticism of Oppenheimer was entered into evidence. Other prominent individuals, including Isidore Rabi and General Leslie Groves, testified in Oppenheimer's defense to varying degrees. The Personnel Security Board issued a 2-1 decision revoking Oppenheimer's clearance. They unanimously found no evidence of disloyalty, but determined that he represented a security risk. On June 29, 1954, the AEC upheld the decision by a 4-1 vote, with Strauss writing the majority opinion, which cited concerns about Oppenheimer's character and past associations. During the hearing, Oppenheimer discussed the left-wing activities of 10 associates, though most of this information was already publicly known. Many in the scientific community viewed him not as someone who implicated others, but as someone unfairly targeted during an era of intense anti-communism. Figures such as Wernher von Braun remarked that, in another country, Oppenheimer might have been honored rather than condemned. Later scholarly work, including analyses of the Vasilyev notebooks from the KGB archives, confirmed that Oppenheimer had not engaged in espionage, although Soviet intelligence attempted to recruit him. Evidence also showed that he removed individuals with questionable loyalties from Manhattan Project work. On December 16, 2022, U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm formally vacated the 1954 decision. She stated that the original process had been flawed and biased, and that evidence accumulated over time affirmed Oppenheimer's loyalty. The reversal drew both support and criticism. Beginning in 1954, Oppenheimer spent several months each year on the island of St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands. 3 years later, in 1957, he purchased a small 2-acre property on Gibney Beach and built a simple house there. The location became a peaceful retreat where he often sailed with his wife Kitty and their daughter Tony. His first public appearance after the loss of his security clearance was a lecture titled Prospects in the Arts and Sciences, part of Columbia University's bicentennial radio series, Man's Right to Knowledge. He had been chosen for the final episode well before the security controversy, and the university kept him in place despite the circumstances. The lecture offered his reflections on the place of science within modern culture. In early 1955, the president of the University of Washington canceled an invitation for Oppenheimer to give a series of lectures. The decision led to notable campus disagreement. More than 1,000 students signed a petition protesting the cancellation, and the University Senate eventually overturned the president's action. Although Oppenheimer never delivered the lectures, he briefly met with several faculty members during a layover in Seattle on his way to Oregon. While in Oregon, he gave 2 talks at Oregon State University on the constitution of matter. During these years, he continued to think carefully about the responsibilities of scientific discovery. He joined Einstein, Russell, Rotblat, and others in forming an organization that would eventually become the World Academy of Art and Science, but he did not participate in major public petitions on nuclear issues, including the 1955 Russell-Einstein Manifesto or the first Pugwash Conference in 1957. Oppenheimer consistently emphasized the challenge of balancing scientific inquiry with political restrictions. His 1953 BBC Reith Lectures, later published as Science and the Common Understanding, explored this theme directly. 2 years later, in 1955, he collected several of his lectures into a book titled The Open Mind, where he argued that American foreign policy could not rely on coercion as a lasting strategy. In 1957, he accepted an invitation from the philosophy and psychology departments at Harvard to deliver the William James Lectures. Although a group of prominent alumni objected to his appearance, the lectures proceeded, and more than 1,000 people attended the series under the title The Hope of Order. Later, in 1962, he delivered the Whidden Lectures at McMaster University, which were published in 1964 as The Flying Trapeze, 3 Crises for Physicists. Throughout this period, Oppenheimer continued to travel, speak, and write. In 1958, he addressed the inauguration of the Nuclear Physics Institute at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel. Between 1958 and 1963, he gave talks across Europe and Japan on subjects such as the development of scientific ideas, their influence on society, and the changing structure of scientific thought. During a 3-week lecture visit to Japan in 1960, he was received with respect and attentiveness. Although he expressed interest in visiting Hiroshima, the sponsoring organization felt it would be better to avoid the site, and he did not travel there. He remained active in academic settings. In 1955, he was the first visiting fellow at Phillips Exeter Academy. In 1957, France named him an Officer of the Legion of Honor. In 1962, he was elected a foreign member of the Royal Society in Britain. Through these activities, Oppenheimer continued to participate in intellectual life, even as he no longer held public influence in matters of national security. His final years were defined by writing, lecturing, travel, and an ongoing effort to reflect on the role of science in a rapidly changing world. In 1959, Senator John F. Kennedy voted against confirming Lewis Strauss, the strongest critic of Oppenheimer during the 1954 security hearings, as Secretary of Commerce, a decision that effectively ended Strauss's political career. When Kennedy became president, he invited Oppenheimer to a White House ceremony in 1962, honoring 49 Nobel laureates. During the event, AEC Chairman Glenn Seaborg quietly asked Oppenheimer whether he wished to pursue another security hearing, which Oppenheimer declined. In 1963, the AEC's General Advisory Committee selected Oppenheimer to receive the Enrico Fermi Award. Although President Kennedy intended to present it, his death intervened. President Lyndon Johnson awarded it instead in December 1963, noting Oppenheimer's significant contributions to theoretical physics and his leadership at Los Alamos. Oppenheimer remarked that granting him the award required some charity and some courage. Jackie Kennedy attended to express her late husband's support. Edward Teller, who had long opposed him, was also present. He had privately recommended the award as a gesture of reconciliation. Despite this symbolic rehabilitation, some political figures remained opposed. Senator Bork Hickenlooper formally protested the decision, and several Republican members of the House AEC committee boycotted the ceremony. Although the award did not restore Oppenheimer's security clearance or practical influence, it did include a $50,000 tax-free stipend. In late 1965, Oppenheimer was diagnosed with throat cancer, likely the result of his long history of smoking. After unsuccessful surgeries and treatment, he died on February 18, 1967, at age 62, at his home in Princeton. A memorial service at Princeton University 1 week later was attended by colleagues, former military officials, family, and prominent figures in politics and academia. His body was cremated, and his ashes were placed in an urn, which Kitty released into the sea near their St. John beach house. Kitty died in 1972. Their son Peter inherited the New Mexico ranch, and their daughter Toni inherited the St. John property. Unable to secure an FBI clearance for a United Nations position, Toni moved permanently to the island and died by suicide in 1977. She left the property to the people of St. John. The beach house was later destroyed in a hurricane. Oppenheimer's security hearing in 1954 marked a turning point in how Americans viewed the responsibilities and risks of scientific work in the nuclear age. To some, he became a symbol of the limits of scientific influence during periods of political tension. While he had cooperated with investigators and testified about colleagues' political affiliations, the process ultimately cost him his role in public policy and deeply affected his reputation. His life has inspired numerous biographies, plays, films, and operas, most notably American Prometheus and the 2023 film Oppenheimer. Scholars often describe his story as a modern tragedy, reflecting the tensions between scientific achievement, political power, and personal responsibility. As a physicist, he was remembered for his insight, breadth of knowledge, and influence on American theoretical physics. even though his rapidly shifting research interests meant he never completed a body of work that led to a Nobel Prize. His name has been applied to an asteroid and a lunar crater. Oppenheimer's career also symbolized the rise of big science, in which scientific research became closely tied to national security and large-scale government institutions during and after World War II. And so, the life of Julius Robert Oppenheimer settles into memory, a mixture of brilliance, ambition, doubt, and consequence. A man who reshaped the modern world, yet spent the rest of his years quietly reflecting on what that reshaping meant. History remembers him with complexity, not as a hero or a villain, but as a reminder of how powerful and fragile human choices can be. As the years moved on, the noise around him faded, leaving only the quiet image of a thoughtful scientist walking along the shoreline of his home on St. John, looking out at the sea. A man who had seen both the heights of discovery and the weight of responsibility. Thank you for listening. Let your mind rest now and drift gently into sleep.